Our next speaker, Jonathan Kim from Emory University, is going to be talking to us about how to safeguard equity in SCA and SCD prevention.
Well, thank you. And first off, again, I just want to thank Michael for really driving this. This is just this whole day and seeing this collaboration and a lot of my ACC American colleagues here. We really hope this is the beginning of a nice tradition of having not just a European meeting and an American meeting, but these collaborative type meetings. So I'm going to talk about equity and disparities in sports cardiology. So this is a topic which, quite frankly, has been a bit of a blind spot for all of us in the field for many years now. But I do believe this is a critical topic as we look to the future, and I do believe we are at a crossroads. My research funding in terms of pertinent disclosure is all relevant to the care of athletes. So this is a big topic. It's a complex topic, and I only have 10 minutes. So this is going to be a bit of an overview, and my objectives are pretty straightforward. We're going to define what race and ethnicity are. We're going to talk about social determinants of health, but we're also going to define what race and ethnicity are not. We're going to dismantle a lot of the misperceptions that exist when we think about race and ethnicity in both clinical medicine and clinical cardiology. We'll talk about disparities in outcomes in young athletes. For this talk, I'm going to focus on disparate risk in terms of sudden cardiac death between self-identified white and black athletes. We'll go through a little bit of data. Data are limited, but over the last year or so, we've begun to have some studies look at social determinants of health and outcomes in young athletes. And then finally, a path forward. And this will be a bit of a 10,000-foot overview as we look to the future. Now, to acknowledge, this is a topic that we just tackled. This is a piece that our ACC Sports Cardiology Council wrote, published in July, talking about racial disparities in sports cardiology. It was led by Sheila Krishnan and Sawala Gusa. But I also want to highlight these three names here. We were really lucky to have the contributions of three internationally recognized experts in the space of disparities and thinking about race in medicine: Quinn Capers, Utibe Essie, and then Amber Johnson. So if you haven't read this, I'd encourage you to read it. Much of what I'm going to talk about is actually much more detailed in this piece. So let's start with some definitions. So what race and ethnicity are? They are socio-political constructs, either based on what you look like and the color of your skin, of course that's race, or claims of shared heritage, traditions, geography, that of course ethnicity. But it's important to note that these constructs are very fluid and dynamic. They can actually change based on changes in social and political context. What race and ethnicity are not, they are not biological constructs. They're not biological variables, and they're really poor proxies for true genetic diversity and ancestry. And so this was actually a really important quote from Svante Pääbo, who's a Swedish geneticist. He's a Nobel laureate in the space of evolutionary genetics. And this was a quote he said after this piece was published in Science back in 2016, talking about race as a social construct. And he states, in the study of complete genomes from different parts of the world, even comparing Africa and Europe, there's not a single absolute genetic difference, not a single variant where all Africans have one and all Europeans have another. And that's even with recent migration disregarded. So again, race and ethnicity are not biological constructs, and they're really poor proxies for genetic diversity and ancestry. So does that mean we should completely discount race and ethnicity when we talk about health outcomes? And of course the answer is no, because we're all aware that, unfortunately or not, race and ethnicity are critical markers of the environmental stressors that clearly dictate health outcomes. And these are the social determinants of health: where you're born, where you grow up, where you live. And we know that these clearly can impact both disease expression as well as health outcomes. So when we talk about young athletes, where do we see disparate outcomes? And I mentioned in my objectives, we're going to talk about risk of sudden cardiac death, where we certainly have data to suggest that self-identified black athletes have been observed to have a higher increased risk of sudden cardiac death. So these data come from U.S. collegiate athletes, a part of our NCAA. I suspect all of you have seen these studies. We have both 10 and 20-year outcomes. The 20-year outcomes was just published at the end of last year, and it was led by Brad Pitek and Kim Harmon. And we know, interestingly enough, over the last 10 years, the overall incidence of sudden cardiac death has declined. But these disparities in outcomes persist, and we just don't understand why. But these exactly mirror what we see in the general population. These are data from the 2020 AHA Presidential Advisory, and here I'm showing total CVD mortality rates across a decade across numerous racial and ethnic constructs. And what we can see is an overall decline across numerous racial constructs, but these disparities among non-Hispanic Black individuals persist. And we know what drives these disparities are social determinants of health, particularly experiences with structural racism and discrimination. So do we have any data at present that have begun to look at social determinants of health and environmental stressors as it pertains to risk of sudden cardiac arrest? Well, I'm happy to follow John on this because he's actually published a couple of really important studies. He actually touched on some data in his talk. But this was really a study that also looked at outcomes in the context of socioeconomic factors. So they looked at exercise SCA among US high school students, but also through the lens of 3 important SCS factors. And the primary outcome measure was survival to hospital discharge. But they looked at this through median family income, percent minority, and those individuals who are receiving free lunch. Data were analyzed over roughly 4 to 5 years, 111 cases as you saw. And interestingly, minorities did actually have a lower survival rate. But what's interesting looking across these 3 important SCS bins was that those athletes who experienced SCA had better survival rates if they came from wealthier families, if they were not minority, and if they were not receiving free lunch. Now, this was not statistically significant, but there was a monotonic increase in survival. Now, hot off the press data earlier this year, John's group was interested also in measures of socioeconomic deprivation, specifically in a measure called the Area Deprivation Index, or ADI. This is a quantitative and validated estimate of neighborhood deprivation. It takes into account numerous measures of social determinants of health, actually 17 to be exact, taken from US Census zip codes, and it comes up with a number. And the higher the number, the more neighborhood deprivation that exists. So they looked at this in the context of athletes who experienced SCA over roughly 7 to 8 years. 312 cases were included, and they did observe actually that among the Black athletes who experienced SCA, mean ADI was higher. Now we have to be careful in terms of taking this conclusion a bit too far. I believe these data are really more hypothesis driving. However, if you look at the compilation of these 2 studies, we are beginning to see that indeed these environmental stressors may actually play an important role as it pertains to the outcome of SCA in a young athlete. Now, my group's been very much interested in actually early cardiovascular risk present in American football players. And we've studied college football years for many years now. And what we found more recently was that incoming Black athletes actually also have higher ADI, but this ADI was associated with measures of early CV risk, more arterial stiffness, higher diastolic blood pressure. And we also queried for experiences with early discrimination. So even at the age of 18 to 19, these athletes reporting many more experiences with discrimination compared to white athletes. Now, how that relates to outcomes still remains to be determined. But we do know that across the US college football landscape, really across all of elite football, there is acquired early CV risk, including the acquisition of a more maladaptive form of concentric left ventricular hypertrophy. It turns out actually that lower median family income is also maybe related to or associated with the acquisition of acquired concentric LVH across the college football career. So environmental stressors, now some data to suggest that they may actually play an important role in terms of some of the cardiac phenotypes that we observed and certainly are concerned about as it relates to early CV risk. Now I want to get back to the 20-year NCAA data. First, acknowledging the incredible amount of work to identify all of the underlying etiologies of sudden cardiac death over the last 20 years, but also a reminder this really was only 13% of the pie. So wouldn't it also be important to look for potential disparities in some of these other bins, particularly accidents, which is the most common cause of sudden death among US collegiate athletes? Now, if, and I want to underscore if, because we don't know, but if it were shown that Black athletes had a higher risk of dying from accidents compared to white athletes, of course, doesn't lead to any conclusions as it pertains to the sudden cardiac death bin. But to me, what it would suggest is a much more holistic view in terms of looking at disparate outcomes across numerous bins. And again, emphasizing that there would have to be other environmental stressors that we're just not taking account of or aware of that are potentially associated with some of these untoward outcomes. So what's our path forward? So there's actually numerous avenues, and I don't have time to get into all of this, but fundamentally, it really begins with a shift away from race-based medicine, as we call it, to a much more race-conscious approach. So what does that mean? It means stopping to look at race through the lens of a biological construct. I really think it's time for us to move away from terminology such as the Black athlete's heart or the Black athlete ECG pattern. These terms are really not appropriate in terms of what race and ethnicity are truly represent. We need to appreciate they are sociopolitical constructs and begin to emphasize these social determinants of health, particularly in many of the outcome studies that we continue to require. So in summary, equity in the care and outcomes of competitive athletes requires a clear understanding of what race and ethnicity are, but also what race and ethnicity are not. We need to appreciate social determinants of health, and we need to appreciate that these constructs are really not biological variables and are very poor proxies for genetic diversity and ancestry. And one of the points that I failed to mention in the beginning, it really makes sense. If you really think about it, how could we possibly think we could classify over 8 billion people in the world into a couple handfuls of racial and ethnic constructs? It just doesn't make sense. There are disparities in several outcomes in competitive athletes, including risk of SCA and SCD. That's just what we discussed in this talk. So we have to have a newfound emphasis on social determinants of health in sports cardiology research. And fundamentally, again, the path forward really requires a shift from the old practices thinking of race-based medicine to a much more race-conscious approach. So hopefully we can stir some more discussion on this, and I really appreciate your attention.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. This was excellent, as always. Any questions from the audience? While it's coming, maybe I can ask you, Jonathan. So how would you suggest that, for example, those ECG features that are more prevalent in the Black race, as it's been reported, so how would we report to that? Again, knowing that the genetic background is not necessarily different, nevertheless, we do see phenotypic manifestations that might be distinct.
Oh boy, putting me on the spot here. So I will fully submit this may be a controversial opinion. This is my own opinion on this, but I believe that if that ECG pattern is considered normal, and certainly the data supports that, then we should consider it normal across all racial and ethnic constructs. And so I personally don't refer it to a Black athlete ECG pattern. And when I come across that among athletes that I screen, I don't screen because the data from Michael and Sanjay have clearly shown this to be non-pathologic. And the point that I keep coming back to is, and again, I would ask this question to anyone, and if there's an answer, please let me know, but I don't know of any other basis in any pathology where an ECG pattern separates something that's completely pathologic from something that's benign solely based on this construct. So again, unless there's, and we don't have the genetics to fully kind of outline this. So that's how I approach that, which is that, yes, it's more prevalent among self-identified Black athletes, but we see it in others. I have a collection of those that I'm accruing on my own. So it's not an isolated phenomenon, and that's how I approach it.
I think it's great. It certainly is a challenge from the first session today, but I think Andre is going to have an answer for that.
Yeah, one of the most thought-provoking speeches of the day. I was just, in terms of that, I'm going to use the term Black athlete ECG, what you did also show on a few people is the increased sudden cardiac death rates amongst Black people. I've always been slightly uncomfortable with this term of a benign ECG because we have to recognise in sports cardiology where every one of our studies are grossly underpowered for sudden cardiac death. And I think someone estimated that to get a tenfold, if there was a tenfold increase in sudden cardiac death associated with that ECG pattern, we'd need a study of over 500,000 athletes. So we don't know that it's benign. And things like early repolarisation that we've associated with young males, there are things that go with populations. So how can we not be sure that that sudden cardiac death rate that's unexplained, that the ECG or other things might be a marker? I mean, sometimes we need these broad descriptives to try to find solutions.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great point. And I mean, for sure, as rigorous and robust as the data are, we don't have really good longitudinal data in terms of outcomes. But in terms of at least standard of care right now, based on the international criteria, that's what I'm focused on. And I think that's in some ways almost another debate and question about that ECG pattern. Is it truly benign or not? Certainly that debate has come up here or there. And I know some continue to image that ECG pattern, and I think that's appropriate if that's the style. But I think my point is that I wouldn't base it off of a self-identified construct.
I think this is a discussion. Oh, sorry. I've been given the hurry up by Michael, but I was just going to make a comment really just with regards to genomics. And I think, you raised the point, Jonathan, and I think it's a real challenge when we think about sudden cardiac arrest and sudden cardiac death, which is that all of our population databases for which we base the ACMG criteria and rare variants are largely driven by Caucasian genomic data sets. And, we certainly have a number of patients in our cohort who we found rare variants. And then when we've delved deeper, they may be Cook Islander, for example, and actually this particular variant's incredibly common in a Cook Islander. So I think we've got a lot to learn in that perspective as well.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
Thank you so much. And I think this is a discussion we need to take in the coffee break.